everyone, and thank you for joining our session today, Navigating SOC 2 Compliance and the 5 Trust Services Criteria. As promised, we will dive into insider perspectives from our experts in streamlining your SOC 2 compliance journey and hear about their real-world insights along with actionable strategies for building an effective and compliant InfoSec program. Before we kick off, I want to remind everybody that the chat feature is available throughout the session. We will be leaving time at the end of the discussion to answer all of your questions and address your comments. To start, I want to give a minute to both of our experts to introduce themselves today. So Metin, would you like to get started?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Nicole. My name is Metin. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer here at Rhymetec. I've been working with the company for about 6 or 7 years now. Just to give a little bit more background about what we do at Rhymetec, we offer cybersecurity services for our customers. We're usually our customers' dedicated security team, helping them with their compliance journey, conducting penetration tests, and really helping them with anything that they may need from a cybersecurity standpoint. We have over 600 clients globally, and we support over 13 compliance frameworks. So we've got a lot of knowledge here, and like our team has a lot of information on the various cybersecurity frameworks here.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Nicole. Hey, everyone. Great to be here. My name is Clark Saldana. I'm an Associate Director of Audit Services at Inside Assurance. So I lead our APAC and some of our Americas team. Just a little bit about Inside Assurance. We were founded in 2020 by former Big Four professionals who really saw that there was a need in the marketplace to offer quality audits at reasonable and affordable pricing and specializing, leveraging compliance automation tools. So really that's Inside Assurance was born. Inside Assurance focuses on audit, attestations, and compliance, ranging from SOC 2 to HIPAA to HITRUST, PCI, ISO, GDPR, FedRAMP, all the acronyms. So we're a global firm with over 80 employees and growing steadily.
Awesome. Thank you both for the introduction. And I guess I'll start by kicking off our first question today. So why is this topic so important and why are we here?
Yeah, so I can go ahead and take that one. So today, really, we're here to dive into the critical topic of SOC 2 compliance and the selection of appropriate trust service criteria for your business. Really, so today in today's digital world, ensuring that security, availability, processing integrity, confidentiality, and privacy of your customer data is really critical. So SOC 2 compliance does not only demonstrate your commitment to these principles, but also builds that trust with your clients and stakeholders. It's really important today to provide you with a clear understanding of what SOC 2 entails, the different trust service criteria, and how to choose the right ones that align with your business objectives and your industry requirements. So hopefully by the end of the session, you should have a pretty solid foundation to make some informed decisions about your SOC 2 compliance and enhance your organization's data protection strategies.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. And like from an MSSP perspective, I think like selecting the right trust services criteria is very important. However, like one thing that's always strange to me is like when customers come to us and like they want to comply with SOC 2 Type 2, a lot of them do not really understand what the trust services criteria are. In some cases, they don't even know that they exist. Like when customers start working with us, we usually need to explain to them what each trust services criteria are, which ones that like they should select for their upcoming SOC 2 audit. So I just see a lot of lack of knowledge, which is also like why I wanted to like talk about this, because I think there's a lot to educate people here to talk to them about like what these trust services criteria are and which ones that like they should select for their organization. And that's what we're going to talk today.
Awesome. And it's definitely a very critical decision-making process that goes into it, which kind of leads us into our next question. All of the early stage planning and decision-making that companies have to do during their SOC 2 journey. So Metin, do you want to get started a little bit more about what is SOC 2, Type 1 versus Type 2, some of these questions?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, yeah, if you're joining this webinar, I'm sure you're kind of familiar with SOC 2 and like what it is. But just to give you some more background, SOC 2 was it's a security and compliance standard that was created by the AICPA. And the primary purpose of SOC 2 is to ensure that third-party companies, SaaS providers, and other organizations, they protect their client information in a secure manner. The SOC 2 audits, they come in two types, type 1 and type 2. And those are the two types that we're going to talk about in a little bit. But at just a high level, when we're talking about a SOC 2 type 1 audit, it's usually just a point-in-time audit. It takes a much shorter time to complete. With our customers, like we can usually get them compliant with SOC 2 Type 1 within the course of about 3 months, and in some cases even less if they have already implemented some security controls. So it's definitely much more quick, very light. But when we're talking about a Type 2 audit, we're talking about a audit period. And usually the audit windows start at a minimum of 3 to 6 months. And with some auditors, they actually require these audit windows to be on an annual basis, just for like a 12-month observation window. And when I say observation window, what I mean is that when customers are going through a SOC 2 assessment, they're not only audited based on what information is available today, they're actually audited based on what has happened over the course of the observation window, which makes the audit definitely more challenging, because within the course of 12 months, if you missed something, if you missed an SLA or an employee was onboarded incorrectly, that might cause some issues with your audit report. But Craig here, I know he is working with Inside Assurance. I know like he can give you a lot more information about it from like an auditor perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So you definitely hit the nail on the head. That type 1 is really the snapshot of the design of your controls. And while that type 2 really showcases how those controls operated over a period of time, also known as your examination period or audit window / period. So just diving straight into it, SOC 2 is definitely not a quick overnight process. Typically it takes several months to get everything sorted out. So you've really got to assess your current setup, identify any gaps, and put new controls in place, then actually undergo the audit. So the timeline can vary based on a lot of factors like the size of your organization, complexity of your systems, how prepared you are going into it. So, as Matt was saying, some companies might breeze through it in a few months, but others might take longer if they're starting from scratch or really dealing with a lot of moving parts. I think compliance automation tools can really help speed up this process. Specifically from the audit perspective, though, as Matt mentioned, you'll typically see about the audit windows being 3, 6, 9, or 12 months from a type 2 perspective. Other windows may be appropriate, but that's kind of at the discretion of your audit firm. Typically, after your audit window ends, your report should be delivered in about 4 to 6 weeks, as long as all your ducks are in a row and there really aren't any major follow-ups. Type 1, though, is typically a little bit quicker, as it's just a point-in-time test of the design of your controls. And that typically takes about 4 weeks after the as-of date to deliver that draft report.
Awesome. And like you said, Craig, it depends differently on your company, where you're at in the process, a lot of other things that come into play. So always great to check with an auditor or a security expert if you have questions on timeline and everything like that. And diving into the next question, love to talk a little bit more about the 5 trust service criteria. Metin, do you want to start here again too?
Yeah, let's talk about what we're actually here to talk about, which is the 5 trust services criteria of SOC 2. So they're already on the screen right now, you can see, but the 5 trust services criteria are security, privacy, confidentiality, availability, and processing integrity. And some of these sound kind of confusing. They're not very just like straightforward. Like, what do we mean by when we say like processing integrity? And like, those are what we're going to like talk about. But when it comes to the trust services criteria, security is pretty much the most common one that we see. Think of the entire like SOC 2 set of controls as, let's say, roughly about like 120 controls. About 70% of that is likely going to be controls related to the security trust services criteria. So when customers are pursuing for a SOC 2 assessment, security trust services criteria is usually selected pretty much by default, and like it is included in every report. The remaining 4 trust services criteria have much less controls that are available, and some of these are more challenging to implement, which is why some companies just go with like the security trust services criteria. But when it comes to which ones to select, at least like from our standpoint, we usually look at what our customers need, what is most important to them, and at the same time, what their customer requirements are. A lot of organizations, they do not just like pursue SOC 2 audits just because they want to. It's usually because their clients are actually requiring them to have a SOC 2 Type 2 report, or that they would like to pursue a larger company that has more strict requirements and they would like to start working with them and they have some compliance needs. And because of that, they're required to usually go through a SOC 2 assessment. Now, in some cases, your clients may actually have specific requirements around availability, around processing of customer information, around privacy, if they are like concerned a lot about these like privacy frameworks that come up. So it just really depends on, like, again, what your customers need, and at the same time, what you really value. Like, do you really value the availability of your customer data? Do you value privacy of your customer data? Sometimes we see customers pursuing all 5 trust services criteria. So I would say it's definitely like a combination of like what your requirements are from your client base, plus what you value in your information security program.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, man. Just echoing those statements. Really choosing the right TSC depends on your business and what you do. So, what data you handle, any regulatory requirements you need to meet. Really look at what matters most for you, for your business, in terms of that security, availability, process integrity, confidentiality, and privacy, and then prioritize the TSC that actually aligns with your business priorities and compliance. It's really about finding the right balance to keep your business secure and compliant, if you will. So I'm just going to go over a few examples of what industries or types of companies TSAs will align with. So security, really regardless of what industry or type of company your organization is, the security trust services criteria is a mandatory component of the SOC 2 report. So the security TSC, also known as common criteria, is really required for all SOC 2 engagements because it forms the foundational layer on which other criteria are built. Next, we'll dive into availability. So when you think about this, think about online retailers and e-commerce platforms that rely on continuous uptime to support their customer transactions. Think about telecom companies that provide communication services and really need to maintain that uninterrupted network availability. And lastly, utilities and other critical infrastructure providers that really need to ensure continuous availability for operational reliability. So those are just a few examples for the availability TSC. Diving straight into processing integrity. Investment firms, accounting firms, and financial service providers that manage financial transactions and require accurate processing data. Manufacturers that rely on automated processing for production and distribution and need to ensure the integrity of their manufacturing systems would want to consider the processing integrity TSC. Confidentiality is the next one. So law firms and legal service providers that handle sensitive client information will want to consider confidentiality. Consulting firms that deal with proprietary business strategies, client data, and intellectual property. Governmental organizations that handle classified or sensitive information will also want to consider confidentiality. Last but not least, privacy, my favorite. So schools, universities, and online education platforms will really want to consider that just because of personal data of students and staff, healthcare organizations that handle patient health information. And then last but not least, online retailers that collect customer information for marketing purposes. So those are really just a few examples of what TSCs go with what industries and potential companies. There's one more thing I want to talk about here. So beyond TSCs, I think there's some confusion as it relates to SOC 2 and being a global company. So if a service or system in the scope of the audit is built, serviced, and production customer data resides throughout the organization in different locations around the world, SOC 2 compliance is not just about what happens in one location or in your headquarters. It's really about ensuring that your entire organization, no matter where it is, meets that SOC 2 standard. So if you're a global company that operates how I just mentioned, you'll basically need to roll out SOC 2 compliance across all your locations and business units. That means getting everybody on the same page, harmonizing policies and procedures, and ensuring that consistent implementation and controls. There's definitely some nuances like local regulations and cultural differences. So you might need to tailor that approach slightly for each region, but you really need to maintain that overall cohesive SOC 2 strategies. But lastly, that is good news when it comes to SOC 2 and being global. It really shows your customers, partners that you take security seriously, no matter where you operate.
Craig, love those examples and appreciate the context around each of the different TSCs. And Mets and I particularly loved your concept around value versus requirements. Definitely a good thing to think about when you're thinking about SOC 2. Diving in further into managing expectations, pain points, resources, scope, what would be the biggest pain point getting through a SOC 2 report? Craig, do you want to start here?
Yeah, sure. So getting through a SOC 2 report is definitely not a walk in the park. Here are some of my biggest pain points that I think. Understanding requirements, so wrapping your head around all the technical stuff definitely takes time. So that's number one. Identifying gaps, so finding out where you're falling short in your security environment and throughout your organization can really feel like a scavenger hunt sometimes. Next is going to be implementing those policies and procedures. So building policies and procedures and pushing them to the organization is key and can really be a monumental task. Implementing controls. So putting new processes in place is definitely easier said than done. Some people are resistant to change or have been doing it one way for a while and don't want to change. So expect some pushback. The actual audit. Get ready to talk through your security environment and answer your auditor's questions. It can be a challenge if you haven't adequately prepared yourself. I think, though, finding a strong audit firm with solid communication can really make all that difference. A few other pain points that I wanted to give a quick overview is writing policies too stringently. We see a lot of companies do this. Let me give you a quick example here. It's like sometimes they write that they perform monthly access reviews. So SOC 2 doesn't require that you do monthly access reviews. It's really about what works for the business. And SOC 2 will use your controls you've designed. So in that case, my recommendation would be semi-annually is enough, but that depends on the criticality and basically the risk those systems pose to your organization. And lastly, I want to talk about overcommitting on timeline. So as we discussed, SOC 2 is definitely not an overnight journey. It's going to take time for your organization to get ready for the audit and also go through the audit. So please don't overcommit and with your customers and say you'll have your SOC 2 badge by next week when they ask.
Yeah, it's definitely not something that's done overnight for sure. I absolutely agree with that. I do see that like one of the biggest like misconceptions that I see with our customers and most people out there is they think of SOC 2 as just like from point 1 to point 2 and then you're done and then you don't have to do anything else. They just want to get their like SOC 2 reports. They want to show that to their customers and then they think that everything is over. We don't have to like put any other resources anymore. And I just feel like that's such a big misconception. I always have to educate people to understand that like when you're going through a SOC 2 audit, once you obtain your reports, especially if you're going through a type 2 audit, from the time you receive your report until next year, you likely need to maintain those controls if you're going through a 12-month observation window. And a 12-month observation window is the standard once you receive your initial SOC 2 type 2 reports. So I just think that that's just such a big like misconception. A lot of customers do not understand that there is ongoing maintenance involved and that they actually need to allocate resources if they want to continue remaining with the SOC 2 Type 2 compliant controls. So I just feel like that's one of also the biggest pain points here is ongoing maintenance when it comes to implementing and maintaining these security controls. And like a couple of examples of those ongoing controls would be things around employee onboarding. Like when you want to pursue SOC 2 Type 2 compliance, your employees need to do certain things upon their onboarding. So like they may need to accept information security policies, they may need to watch security awareness training. This isn't something that you do only during the observation window and then stop doing afterwards. This is something you're going to need to do on an ongoing basis as long as you want to remain SOC 2 compliant. And there are other security controls included there as well, like ensuring all your devices are encrypted, making sure that you are remediating your security vulnerabilities based on the SLAs. When it comes to the SOC 2 controls, I like to usually separate them by point-in-time controls and also controls that need to be ongoing and they need to be maintained on a daily basis, which are daily operating controls. And when we talk about the point-in-time controls, those are security controls like access reviews, penetration tests, like Craig mentioned, risk assessments, things that you do on a maybe like an annual basis, on a biannual basis, on a monthly basis, whatever like the frequency that you have set there. But when it comes to daily operating controls, those are things that you actually need to maintain on a daily basis, meaning somebody has to be monitoring certain platforms. They need to be checking if all the employees are onboarded correctly. They need to be monitoring if all the vulnerabilities are remediated based on the SLAs. So there's just a lot more work involved than just getting to the finish line and obtaining your reports, because there's actually some like ongoing maintenance required after you receive your report. So that's just what I wanted to say in terms of like the biggest pain points there that I see my clients challenge.
Yeah, and leading into the next question, when you're talking about some of these pain points, let's talk a little bit more about resources too. So Craig, what sort of resources would companies need in order to get SOC 2 compliant?
Yeah, so I think while you might be able to manage with existing staff, really having dedicated resources to manage your SOC 2 compliance program can streamline process and really ensure everything runs smoothly. So there's going to be a little bit of nuances here, but there isn't special treatment for a small organization from a SOC 2 perspective. So really the expectation is to meet the spirit of the criteria, whether you're a 1-employee company or a 1,000-employee company. So remember, some of your resources during your compliance journey could potentially be wearing multiple hats in the business. So whether it's like acting as a CSM, working on business development, etc. So to summarize, organizations can manage this in-house, or sometimes they need outside help like vCISOs. But really, if you're a smaller operation or a master multitasker, you could get by without too many dedicated resources, but you got to be ready for some late nights and maybe some extra coffee.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I also think that company size matters a lot. I think that if you are just about like 30 employees, there's probably a lot less work involved to maintain SOC 2 compliance compared to an organization that has like thousands of employees. So I know when you're like a lot bigger, you're likely going to need some like dedicated resources, whether that's like some external resources like a third-party virtual CISO company, or you may need to have like your own dedicated security team. Obviously, that's up to discussion. But I do think that like whether you want to utilize external resources or utilize internal security resources, some people actually have to be assigned security responsibilities. So if you choose not to have like your own dedicated security team or some level of external resources, that means non-security personnel may need to be assigned security responsibilities to ensure controls are maintained and they are implemented. And they're going to have to be educated on SOC 2 and the control language, just so they understand what they need to maintain and they are understanding like how to implement those security controls. So I do agree, like having some external resources is definitely helpful, because then you have professionals who understand the framework actually implementing and maintaining the controls, compared to non-security personnel that have to learn that. And that just becomes a bigger challenge for organizations.
Awesome. And going off of this too, obviously, when you're thinking about scope, there's a who is in scope and what is in scope. So Craig, what would you say for who is in scope for SOC 2?
Yeah, absolutely. So I like to think about this as any users that are critical to the delivery of the system or service that we are auditing, in addition to anybody that has access to sensitive data, customer data, or production data should really be in scope. So this could include your core team, like your IT security, compliance, even key players from like HR, finance, operations. And a lot of people, I think, forget about consultants or contractors with access to sensitive data, customer data, or production data.
Yeah, when it comes to the what's here in terms of systems, I would say like, especially if you have a SaaS product or other like technical systems in place, think about what's in production, what actually impacts your customers. Usually when we go through a SOC 2 type 2 audit, staging environments, test environments that do not impact customer systems are not monitored or even audited. Usually, when you go through an audit, the auditors will be looking into the production systems, production networks, and other sort of like production devices that actually impact customers. This also applies to any third-party vendors that you're working with. If a vendor that you're working with doesn't impact customers in any way, it doesn't really process sensitive information, there's a likely chance that that can be just assigned a low risk and it won't really be subject to the same scrutiny as high risk vendors like your hosting provider or like your email provider. So I think it just really depends on like what systems impact your customers and contain customer information. And that actually helps reduce the scope and help you go through the SOC 2 audits in a much easier way, because when you do reduce your scope, there's definitely a lot less work involved on the auditor side and also on the customer side.
Great. And leading into our next question too, talking a little bit more about building a foundation for your information security program, getting SOC 2 compliant. Metin, how do you write appropriate policies and procedures?
I think Craig mentioned this earlier, actually. With SOC 2, it doesn't really provide guidelines around timelines, timeframes, SLA remediation. It really depends on you to figure out what your timelines are going to be. So when building information security policies, it's important to discuss internally what your timelines are going to be. Like, for example, SLA remediation for security vulnerabilities. You may need to set your own timelines after a discussion with your engineering team. Maybe you want to remediate critical vulnerabilities within 15 days or within 30 days. SOC 2 doesn't have guidelines around that. So I think in that sense, it gives a lot of power to the organizations. It's basically telling you that, like, hey, you set your own rules in certain pieces and see which ones you can do at a certain time frame. And I think like that really helps for building a better information security program, because when it comes to some other standards, like let's say like PCI DSS as an example, they have some strict guidelines for timeframes and for like SLA remediation. And that usually causes some issues, especially with like engineering teams, because if you cannot abide by those timelines, then that means you're going to have an exception in your audit report. And that might mean that you might need to utilize additional resources, or you might need to put additional efforts into actually implementing these controls. So I think in that sense, SOC 2 is definitely more flexible, but it still requires a lot of planning and internal discussions to build your own policies, timelines, and other SLAs.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. Yeah. So I kind of like to think about this as a 7-step process. So first is really understanding SOC 2 requirements. So getting familiar with what TSC that your business is going to be doing. So whether it's security, availability, processing integrity, confidentiality, or privacy. Step 2 is identifying the needs. So assess your organization's processes and systems to really pinpoint where policies and procedures are going to be needed. 3 is collaborate. So work with stakeholders from IT, security, legal, HR, and compliance to really gather that input and ensure consistent buy-in. Next is to draft policies. So develop clear policies and procedures with the SOC 2 framework in mind. Next is documenting and reviewing. So document those policies with clear objectives, responsibilities, and really procedures in mind, and review those with the stakeholders for accuracy and relevance. Next is going to be training communication. So provide the training on the policies and ensure that the employees actually understand the policies and their role in the compliance environment, and how you're going to push these policies out to staff. Last is monitor and update. So regularly monitor compliance, conduct internal audits, and update policies as needed as There's changes in the environment, regulations, organizational needs, etc. So just a little summary there. On top of that, though, I wanted to quickly talk about how risk assessments and threat landscape can affect the selection of TSCs. So when we think about performing a risk assessment, the organization is really identifying areas of concern where they see risk or where it's potentially weak in their environment. So this really helps drive selection of TSCs. I'm going to use some practical examples here. Maybe there are several customers that have concerns about a product or service uptime, and that came up as an item in the risk assessment. This may have driven the inclusion of the availability TSC, as customers want some insurance around your uptime and availability. Another example is the organization may have identified a risk around data classification and data retention, thus prompting that confidentiality TSC to be included. So risk assessments, if done correctly, are really a critical component in the TSC selection process as well. So just thought I'd add that in there.
Thank you, Craig, for that last tidbit about risk assessments. And our final question, and probably a very important one, what tools or advice would you have for the listeners or anybody that'll be watching the recording for next steps? Craig, do you want to start this one?
Yeah, sure. So first off, consider using compliance automation tools for streamlined processes. We see clients save time to focus on their business by really leveraging compliance automation tools in the market. Seek advice from compliance experts for guidance. Choose the right vCISO or the right auditing partner. Invest in internal training to really ensure that everybody understands their roles and processes in not only the SOC 2 journey, but your overall compliance journey. Next is implementing continuous monitoring for ongoing compliance. So any basically instances of non-compliance or anything that falls out of compliance is quickly rectified, and you can avoid some of those potential exceptions. And then keep thorough documentation for really any areas that fall out of compliance during your audit. So at least so you have a justifiable business reason for why that occurred. And I would just say, remember, compliance is really an ongoing journey. So stay proactive and keep improving daily.
Thanks, Craig. Yeah, I think like using compliance monitoring platforms is very important, especially like in today's world where like spreadsheets just don't cut it anymore. I think that just like streamlines the process. I just don't like spreadsheets and it just makes it more difficult to use. But I do also want to say, like, I think on top of using like compliance monitoring tools, having a solid project management tool is also very important. Like you said, like there's a lot of work involved here, and it's not going to be only completed by one person. There's likely going to be 10 or 15 stakeholders, and they're going to need to follow these controls and actually track them to completion. And in some cases, they may need to do these on a regular basis, on a monthly basis. So I think having a solid project management tool and adding certain tasks, some regular things like your pen tests, like your access reviews, risk assessments, even just like simply adding them there and assigning them to the right personnel could really help, because there's so much work involved. It's so easy for one of these tasks to be just like lost in the translation and not done by the time like you get to your SOC 2 reports and your audit, and it might cause an exception, and customers don't like exceptions. So I think just like being able to fully track these in a project management tool is super important. Aside from that, I do think that there are some tools that you're just going to have, like vulnerability monitoring tools, intrusion detection systems. If you don't have single sign-on or like multi-factor authentication systems, you might need to invest in some of those. It's just really going to depend on like what controls apply to you. But I would say like on top of continuous monitoring, definitely project management tools and all the other like security controls like vulnerability monitoring and IDS, IPS.
Awesome. Thank you. And yes, Metin, I hate spreadsheets too, so couldn't agree more. Well, I'd like to offer the audience, if you guys have any questions, feel free to add them to the chat. I see we have one right here. Which individual controls or areas do you find companies tend to be most commonly weak on when getting SOC 2 compliant or SOC 2 audited?
Yeah, I can go ahead and take that first. So typically where we see some areas that are concerning to us is risk assessments. I think a lot of companies forget to include the fraud, a fraud component within their risk assessment, and that's part of the criteria within SOC 2. Another area that we see is termination SLAs. Sometimes organizations just write those policies just too stringently. So they'll say, hey, they terminate their employees within 8 hours and all system access is removed. There's no hard requirement that states that you have to do it within 8 hours. So I would really take that into consideration, see what works for the business, and then write those appropriate policies and procedures with essentially what works with your organization. Next thing is vulnerability SLAs. So we see this as being an area of concern as well. A lot of people can't remediate those because of either resource constraints or potential budgetary constraints. And they don't document this with business justification to potentially avoid those exceptions. So that's going to be key as well to document that.
Awesome. Metin, anything else to add?
No, I think like Craig, yeah, that all like makes sense. I do think that like with employee termination, I always like see that mistake as well, because it's not really like something that people track, or even if they track, they forget to actually track it against the SLAs that they have set, which is like one of the most reasons like why a lot of people like get exceptions in SOC 2 reports. I would also say like vulnerability remediations is one of the big things. Like I could say like even like sometimes I make mistakes around that and like remediating vulnerabilities on time, because there's just like so many released on a daily basis, just like hundreds, thousands of vulnerabilities out there. So really being able to resolve them on time, and if you can't, creating proper risk assessments around those vulnerabilities is super important. I've had exceptions about that before, and I think if I do, that means a lot of other people are doing as well. So I would say like that's also an important point to take.
Awesome. And I'm jumping to a latter question that came in around exceptions. So how do exceptions in SOC 2 audits work?
Yeah, sure. I can go ahead and take that. So SOC 2 exceptions will show up within your section 4 within the table, and also we'll add a section 5 within your report to allow you to respond to those exceptions as well. If there are multiple exceptions in a criteria and based on the severity, these could escalate to a qualification, which would essentially modify the opinion of the report. That's not something that you want. When a reader is looking at your report, you don't really want a modification of the opinion. That's a bad thing. So all exceptions won't escalate to a qualification, but depending on the severity, it could escalate to that.
Thank you, Craig. And I think the next question is around like SOC 2 education. So what certifications would help in building a solid knowledge base for implementing SOC 2 controls?
I can take that over. When it comes to like implementing some baseline cybersecurity frameworks, I would actually consider SOC 2 as a baseline. I don't see a lot of companies like pursue SOC 2 Type 2 compliance after they have implemented like other more strict cybersecurity frameworks. But if we were talking about like what is the closest like familiar framework, I would probably say ISO 27001. I think it has a lot of good controls around building information security systems. It has a lot of good controls around user onboarding, vulnerability remediation. There's a lot of overlap. So if a organization already has implemented ISO 27001, that means they likely already have the knowledge and they may actually probably pass a SOC 2 audit without any exceptions, given like some additional controls that they may need to implement. But I would say that's probably like one of the closest frameworks to implement if you're looking to go through SOC 2. But again, I'm just going to be honest, I don't see that happening quite often. I think most organizations actually go with SOC 2 before they pursue other cybersecurity frameworks like ISO 27001, PCI DSS, HIPAA. I think that SOC 2 just like comes as one of the baseline cybersecurity frameworks already.
And where would you say you would go for gaining that knowledge to understand like what controls you need to implement? Like, is there a certain certification or like a course that you would recommend to somebody that's looking to maybe do this for their company and build that knowledge base?
There are definitely courses out there, but I would also say AICPA has some good guidance and documentations on their website about the specific controls. I think like those are also good information for anyone to have. Like it's a long standard, but I think if you are doing this like for the first time and like you want to educate yourself, I think it is important to read and understand the standard. And there are definitely courses out there that can also help you for sure.
Awesome. Perfectly put. It doesn't look like we have any more questions coming in at this time. Would you guys like to add any additional feedback or just last comments before we leave?
No, I mean, from my end, I really appreciate the time, Nicole and Metin, and thank you to the audience that joined. It's really been a pleasure to educate you all, hopefully about SOC 2 and TSCs. So thank you for your time.
Yeah, it was great chatting with you, Craig and Nicole as well. I know we've done this a few times before, so always good to see your faces. But yeah, I hope this has been helpful and informational for the audience that have joined here. So I hope we were able to help you answer some questions that you had in your mind.
Yeah, and thank you, Craig, and thank you, Metin, for joining us and being experts on this discussion. And thank you, everybody else who is able to join us today. In the coming days, we'll be sure to share the recording of this webinar, along with some other helpful materials from both Rhymetec and Inside Assurance. And again, a special thank you to Craig and Metin for their collaboration and their time today. We appreciate everybody's time and look forward to seeing you in the future. So thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.